That next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we're celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, but first, here's a quick look at the top headlines trending right now on LinkedIn. Biden brings back job search rules. Google to pay creators on its TikTok competitor named YouTube Short, and Asian Americans face barriers at work. Let's take a deeper look into that story. Despite being the fastest growing racial group in the US, Asian Americans make up only 12% of the workforce and occupy about 4% of Fortune 1000 board members, according to data from Pan-Asian organization Ascend. Asian Americans have also been found to be the least likely racial group to be promoted. Another report from organization Launch found that many Americans believe that anti-Asian American racism isn't a problem that should be addressed. Joining me now to discuss this is Norman Chen. He's the CEO of Launch, leading Asian Americans to unite for change. Norman, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Good morning.
All right, let's just dive headfirst into this report. I found so many of the statistics to be completely startling as well as devastating. Let's start with this fact that hate crimes against Asian Americans are climbing across the US, and yet over a third of white Americans are saying it's not happening. What's with this disconnect?
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, despite all the press coverage of the hate crimes, especially after Atlanta, nearly 40% of white Americans still are not aware of the increase in hate crimes towards Asian Americans. So this is a huge issue. We're not sure where they're getting their information from. Are they not having the opportunity to interact with Asian Americans? But clearly, this is a significant group of the US population that is unaware, uninformed, and unmotivated to create change or improvements.
And one of the findings of the report about this has to do with this model minority myth that the report discusses, which is when we talk about issues of race, Asian Americans tend to be left out. They're invisible in these discussions. Can you tell us a little bit about what this model minority myth is and how it's impacting the stats of the report?
Yeah, it's really, really powerful and pernicious over the years. So Asian Americans since the 1960s have been classified as the model minority. And this was part of the civil rights movement and trying to establish, good minorities versus not so good minorities. And so there are a lot of negative effects of the model minority myth. Number one, it makes Asian Americans into an envied other group that is targeted during times of crisis. And hate crimes research shows that targeted envy groups can be targeted with violence. Number two, it divides communities of color who are criticized for failing to achieve the MMM ideals. And thirdly, it really treats the Asian American community as a monolith and hides the real needs and issues for many in the community who suffer economically, socially, and otherwise.
And speaking of that monolith, how does that impact Asian Americans as they come into the workplace? And when you couple that with this model minority myth, how are these issues kind of compounding themselves to create prejudice and biases for them as they walk into work, virtually or not?
Yeah, one of the key data points we found is that while Asian Americans are severely underrepresented in leadership positions, Americans in general, nearly about 50% of Americans believe that Asian Americans are fairly or even overly represented in senior positions in companies, politics, and media. So this model minority myth perpetuates into the workplace, where people think that Asians are well represented when in fact we're severely underrepresented.
And why do you think that is? We're going to bring up that stat right now. You just mentioned it, but 53% of respondents said that Asian Americans are well represented in leadership. Is that because of this model minority myth? Are there other compounding prejudices that are fueling the statistic?
Yeah, we asked people in America, what are the 3 adjectives you would use to describe Asian Americans? And the top 3 were smart, intelligent, hardworking, and nice, which on the surface are positive. So based on that, people think, oh, Asian Americans must be successful. They must be leaders in the workplace. They're not aware of the discrimination and the other barriers against Asian Americans, which are prohibiting and preventing Asian Americans from reaching that point in corporations and in power positions. So hence the huge gap and hence the need for action.
And Norman, another stat that really startled me from the report is 24% of white Americans do not believe that anti-Asian American racism is a problem today. We just discussed the wave of hate crimes that have now just consumed the national discussion in many cases. Is this changing? Talk to us a little bit about why Launch was formed and what you're seeing on the forefronts of change right now.
Yeah, we were formed by a group of friends who just decided that the trajectory that the country was going on with regards to anti-Asian American sentiment was not the right trajectory. And so we are actively working to document and measure how attitudes towards Asian Americans are today and how they're going to change over time. I am encouraged, with all this awareness and activism among Asian American groups and non-Asian American groups, we are really starting to see momentum now in the media, in the workforce, in other ways that will hopefully create meaningful change going forward. So yes, I'm optimistic. It's going to take time, and hopefully our effort and other efforts will be part of that change.
So I see a lot of business leaders joining us in the stream right now. What is your recommendation for them as we're thinking about return to office right now, as we're thinking about a lot of issues of the future of work? What are some best practices that Launch is recommending to right some of these wrongs that have just historically devastated the Asian community at work?
Yeah, we think corporations have a huge role to play in this, and it's through their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, really raising awareness within their employee base, within their leadership, about the issues, number one. Number two is then helping to identify and promote candidates for senior leadership positions. And thirdly is using their resources to go into the community and support organizations that are doing work that help to lead to this kind of positive change. So there's a great role for corporations to play, and some corporations are stepping up. We just need more to do so.
And Norman, before I let you go, I see a lot of interest in the stream about this report. And any stat that you think is particularly enlightening that we should focus on? Actually, but you know what? Actually, before I even ask you that, I wanted to ask you about this lack of knowledge of Asian role models across industries. A lot of people who were surveyed couldn't even name one, let alone someone as famous as Jackie Chan. Yes. What's going on there? That was devastating to me, but what were your thoughts?
Yeah, that is one of the most shocking and disappointing results. When we asked people to name prominent Asian Americans, 42% of our respondents, which were representative of the country, said none or I don't know. They could not think of a prominent Asian American. This is despite Kamala Harris, despite Andrew Yang, despite Yo-Yo Ma, despite Jeremy Lin. So it shows that we are still largely invisible in the minds of Asian Americans. There's a lot of opportunity for us in the corporate world, in the entertainment world, in the sports world to increase our visibility. And again, with all this new activism and continued activism by many Asian American organizations, we're really hoping to shape that conversation and be more visible, more prominent, and more recognized.
Well, Norman, I see a ton of members in the stream just really appreciative of the work that you're doing, and we really appreciate you joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
That was Norman Chen. He's the CEO of Launch, breaking down the latest report from Launch about discriminations and prejudice against the Asian American community. And for more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. While the rise in crimes against Asian Americans has taken the national stage, discrimination against Asian Americans happens every day and often goes undiscussed. This can be particularly detrimental in the workplace where Asian workers have to combat stereotypes decades in the making. What can managers do to fight these biases head on? Joining us now to discuss is Ruchika Tulsyan. She's the founder and CEO of Candor and the author of an upcoming book about women of color at work. Ruchika, it is so great to see you.
Thank you for having me, Caroline.
All right, I actually want to start with the viewers in the stream, letting everyone know that Ruchika and I talked a few months ago, and one of the things that she said to me, which has stuck with me since the last few months, is a lot of people were surprised about the rise in crimes that we're seeing across the country against Asian Americans, but you were not surprised. Why weren't you surprised?
Yeah, I think I want to piggyback a little bit off what Norman talked about, the invisibility that a lot of Asians and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders face in the United States, where largely because there are a couple of models of success, some of the big tech CEOs are men, Asian men who have managed to ascend to the highest ranks of corporate America. There's this belief that overall we're doing really well. As well as in the model minority, added to the model minority myth of this idea that, Asian Americans are doing really well. We're financially overall very successful. We're quiet. We don't really rabble rouse, and therefore we're fine. And actually, under the surface, what I was starting to see in my day-to-day interactions is that actually the people were facing, Asian American and especially Asian American women were facing discrimination. They were facing marginalization. They were facing challenges both in the workplace as well as out in society. So for me, this felt like it was about to happen. It was like a perfect storm waiting to happen, and bring in the racial justice movement of last year and the sort of re-reckoning that we saw after the murder of George Floyd, and then add to that some of the very nasty rhetoric about political leaders calling the coronavirus by other names and incorrect and racist names, essentially. And then the pandemic itself and the frustrations and the job losses and all the pain and trauma and devastation of the pandemic. And it was a perfect storm waiting to happen. So for me, it was devastating. It's been really hard to see the rise in hate crimes. And yet I want to emphasize that anti-Asian sentiment is not new.
And speaking of that not newness, I want to connect that back to what you were just discussing in terms of the racial reckoning we're seeing against systemic racism in the Black community right now. And this is being coupled with the rise in hate crimes against the Asian community. How do you see these movements as similar? How are they different?
Yeah, I think the experience of racism, sadly, is very common across communities, right? Being marginalized, being underestimated, losing out on opportunities, and especially for me, I really study the workplace, and that has been my expertise over the last decade. But really looking at the way, people from non-white communities struggled both to be recruited into organizations and certainly to be advanced within the organization. And so I think there's similarity in that experience of being underestimated, of not having the opportunities to succeed. Now, where it sort of differs, especially within, sort of the Asian community and other communities, and I do want to also emphasize, as Norman said, Asians are not a monolith, but even within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, what we start to see is that there are all these ideas, again, about our success and how we don't need support. And due to the long history of anti-Blackness in this country, there's this idea that, to ascend and to move racial equality forward, we only need to focus on the Black community. And actually, in reality, we need to focus on all communities that have experienced and have been touched by racism, sadly.
Absolutely. Ruchika, I'm going to take a moment to say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream right now. We have Jerome from California, Robert from Massachusetts, Peter from San Diego, and Kathleen from Tennessee. And if you're just joining us here on LinkedIn News Live, I'm here with Ruchika Tulshian. She's an expert in all things diversity and inclusion, but today we're talking about the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans and what that looks like in the workplace. So if you have questions specific to that or just want to know more about Ruchika, let us know in the stream and we'll have a conversation about that on today's show. Ruchika, I want to just double click a little bit on not thinking about Asians, not thinking about Asian Americans as a monolith, because I think it's a really important discussion to have on this platform. I think a lot of people, when they think of Asians at work, they think of successful tech entrepreneurs, people who are doing well in the tech community. But of course, that's not representative of everyone. Break down a little bit for us why that type of thinking is so dangerous.
Yeah. Firstly, just to clarify, Asian American, just this term, this catch-all term, which I understand why we do need to have an Asian American Pacific Islander political identity. And that's where this term AAPI really started in the 1960s with this idea born out of the civil rights movement that we too need to have a political identity, largely to show solidarity with our, with Black and African American communities here in the United States that have experienced, centuries of oppression. At the same time, I think something that we really need to understand is when we have these ideas that we don't need support, that our issues don't need addressing, they become invisible. And that's what we've seen in society. Within Asian, just this category, again, we're not a monolith. We're made up of so many cultures, languages, religions, immigration journeys. And I want to talk a little bit about how much immigration journeys make such a difference about your experience here in the United States, both in the workplace as well as in society in general. But when you have such a variance within one group, it becomes really dangerous if we just focus on the superstars, right? Because largely, a big part of our community is also struggling, whether it's to do with the rise in anti-Asian violence, whether it's to actually do with a lack of socioeconomic opportunities. We have the largest intergroup variance in terms of income levels. So on the one hand, you have, the median Indian or Chinese family in the United States that has very high income levels, especially compared with other minority groups in the country. And then you have, in the same category of Asian, you have Burmese and Nepalese immigrants who really, really suffer from poverty and insecurity in society. So we do need to look at it as a whole. We can't just focus on the superstars and forget everyone else.
We certainly need to think of it as a whole. We also need to think about this through an intersectional lens. And so I want to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing right now for your book about women of color. Let's talk about Asian women specifically. What are the stereotypes that they face at work? What are they up against?
Yeah, so there's this term, the bamboo ceiling, and it was coined a couple of decades ago. And one of the main ideas behind it is, women, and largely white women, face what's called the glass ceiling in the workplace. And for Asian women, that ceiling is even further reinforced by this concept of the bamboo ceiling, where we experience, that level of invisibility. We're a safe pair of hands. We're going to get the work done. We're not going to push back. And as a result, we're not going to be good leaders, right? So I think there's a lot of nuance in this conversation. On the one hand, we need to readdress and really re-examine what makes a good leader, right? And research actually shows it isn't someone who sort of pounds their fists on the table and always has, strong opinions, but rather effective leadership does require collaboration and being more and being a good listener, actually, and sort of influencing people to speak and bring their best selves forward. So on the one hand, there's that. On the other, the drawback of the bamboo ceiling, or this idea of Asian women specifically being really submissive, is research from Ascend. The Ascend Foundation finds that while Asian women are the most likely to be hired into tech jobs in the Bay Area, they're the least likely to be promoted. So we really find that as a whole, Asian women often get stuck where we have very high degree, we have high levels of education, we have a lot of experience, and yet we're not able to ascend to the highest levels. We're not able to make manager or leader. We're not able to get tenure in the academic workplace. And so there's a lot of work to be done. We can't just sort of stagnate into being recruited, and we need to look at what happens and what are the barriers to our success as we go forward.
Bamboo ceiling, it's such a devastating term, but I think it's appropriate. I'm thinking of myself trying to break through the traditional glass ceiling. I feel like that's a little bit harder to punch, a little bit easier to punch through than bamboo. I think it'd be pretty hard to try and punch through a piece of bamboo, if I'm correct.
Absolutely. And also this idea, and I'm kind of coming up with my own interpretation of it, but this idea that we're very flexible, that we're just going to take whatever comes our way and roll with it, that we don't have an opinion on matters. And I think that becomes very hard for Asian women who are in any way, counter to that stereotype. I know I personally have experienced a lot of pushback and surprise. Oh, wow, you negotiate for yourself. Oh, wow, you speak up for yourself. And sort of those underhanded, oh, well, we expected you to be a certain way, but you're not. And I found that actually can have much more of a negative impact on my career sometimes than even this perception that I'm just going to be quiet and I sort of play along with that stereotype. And therefore, a lot of the narratives about ascending women in the workplace, this idea of leaning in, this idea of negotiating better or being more confident, doesn't exactly fit in for women of color. And that has been very much the reason why I take an intersectional approach to the work I do and really look at how race and gender impacts women in the workplace.
Well, Chika, let's talk about that a little bit more. I actually want to bring up something that you said recently, actually, in an article in the New York Times. You said, every woman I interviewed spoke about how she felt both invisible and visible at the same time. And this becomes even stronger as you progress. You don't want to ruffle feathers by being too ambitious. Being ambitious is a good thing for a lot of people in corporate America. For Asian women, how does that ambition kick them in the butt?
I actually want to talk about how every woman I interviewed, every woman of color I interviewed for my book, not only Asian women, every woman talked about how it was very difficult. Black women, Latinx women, Indigenous women, and women around the world that I spoke with talked about how if you were non-white, it was very, very difficult to succeed because you were seen as someone who had to play along with the stereotypes, right? or you had to navigate a very narrow tightrope between the stereotypes. So I talked with a lot of Black women who talked about how they had to be really careful about not showing, their passion in the workplace or showing their ambition in the workplace, because they were very, very scared and worried about the stereotype of being typecast as angry Black women, a terrible, harmful, discriminatory myth, right? For Asian American women and Asian women I spoke with, both living in Asia and then outside diaspora, a lot of women talked about how they had to play along with the stereotype of being really submissive, of being very grateful for what they had. So I interviewed a woman of color who, interestingly, was Asian and Black. She presented as an Asian woman, and she talked about how when she negotiated for a market rate salary in a new job offer, she was actually met with a lot of surprise and pushback. And literally the hiring manager said, I thought you'd just be grateful that we, gave you this opportunity. So that plays a very challenging, that really plays into the challenge of being able to be, to advance in the workplace. And therefore there's this idea that you're supposed to be invisible. You're not supposed to ruffle the feathers. You're supposed to be really quiet, but you're also hyper visible. Often you walk in, a lot of Black women I spoke to talked about this. A lot of Asian women who lived outside sort of the big metro areas talked about what it's like if you are the only Asian or Black or Latinx woman and you walk into a room, suddenly everyone's looking at you. Suddenly everybody has these ideas. Maybe they read a book, maybe they watched a movie that really propelled that harmful stereotype forward. The one statistic I bring up a lot in the work I do is by PRRI, and they found that 3/4 of white Americans don't have a single friend of color. So the majority of white Americans who first interact in any meaningful way with people who are different from them is actually in the workplace. This is why I believe it is the role of managers and leaders and workplace corporations to fix some of the challenges that we see.
Well, I'm seeing the stream is blowing up, Ruchika. I have a comment here from Shannon who said, oftentimes AAPI women's and women's of color work is not credited or even stolen and passed off as others. We also have Jeremy from Washington, D.C. joining us, Stephanie from Ohio, and Rhonda from Texas. So thanks for joining us in this conversation. Ruchika, I feel like we could spend the next hour just unpacking all of the issues and stereotypes. And I hope we can't do that, but I hope that people do pick up your book when it launches so that they can learn even more. But I want to make sure that we have time to switch just to some solutions. I'm seeing some questions in the stream right now of what needs to change, what can be done. Let's talk specifically for white allies, particularly in the workplace. What are some things that they can do tomorrow, today, to change some of these behaviors?
I'm really glad that someone in the comments brought up credit, because that's something we don't talk about enough. I actually have a whole chapter on how important it is to credit women of color for their ideas. And literally, if you're a white ally and you're in a meeting and someone who, again, back to this idea of both being hyper visible as well as invisible, if a woman of color brought up a great idea, it's important to recredit her. Ruchika brought up this great point, and here's something that I'd like to add to that. And really credit women and women of color for the work that they do. I think that's really important. I think about all of us living our lives nowadays online on social media. Retweet and follow women of color, share our work, share our expertise, share our research, share the work that we're doing in trying to diversify our communities. I think that's really important. For managers and leaders, I really want to talk about what seems like a very small thing, but research, especially both in the K-12 education and then especially in the workplace around recruiting, shows that if you have a non-Anglo-Saxon name, you are going to experience discrimination both in education and then especially in workplaces, right? You have a smaller chance of being called back for an interview if you have a non-Anglo-Saxon name. So if you have a very Asian ethnic sounding name or you have a Black ethnic sounding name. And so I really want managers and leaders to take the time to get people's names correct, right? I have an unusual name. Ruchika is not very common, and people will often say it wrong. And in the past, I would feel a lot of shame and I would say, humiliation. I would say, I don't want to correct them. Now, when I do correct them, sometimes I'll actually notice that either people will not take the moment, they won't take a chance to sort of get it right, practice it, and get it right the next time around, even if I interact with them very often. Or they'll say something like, oh, that's too difficult. Do you have a nickname? Do you have a short name? Can I just call you something else? And that is really where I see a lot of the challenges come up, right? And that's really, and I think the advice to leaders then would be try and get names correct, right? It means a lot, whether it's names, whether it's not mistaking, one Asian person, one employee for another. That happens a lot. That's really common, very, very upsetting, really stressful. And then I think what I was surprised to learn is Shailene Gupta, who is a writer for HBR, she interviewed Asian American employees in the workplace, and she talked about and found that largely Asian employees were really disappointed that leaders didn't take a stance against a lot of the anti-Asian hate crimes and hate speech and violence that we have seen in our society. And I do think it's the role of leaders to stand up and say, condemn it, say this is absolutely unacceptable, remind people in their organizations you cannot treat other people like that. I think more than anything else, check in with your Asian American employees, check in with people right now and just say, are you doing all right? I know we're dealing with this terrible pandemic, and then we're dealing with this rise of hate crimes. How can I be there for you? How can I support you?
Ruchika, giving Asian women the credit that they deserve for the work that they're doing, getting their names right, and just acknowledging the devastating impact of these hate crimes maybe having on them at work sounds baseline. But I think it's really important because so many leaders are getting this wrong right now. But before I let you go, Ruchika, I'm so excited for your book. I want to hear a little bit more about any insights that you think that our viewers in the stream would like to know about what you're working on, anything that is showing you some bright light at the end of this devastating pandemic tunnel.
Yeah, I think as we're actually talking about return to office, it's actually important to think about how different communities are approaching this big topic, like when are we going back? What's it going to look like? Are we going to go back? Is there going to be a hybrid model? And I think for a lot of Asian American AAPI employees, at least I can certainly speak about this, from a personal standpoint, many of us deal with, or we live in multi-generational households, or we're responsible for older people or younger people in our communities. It could maybe not even be family members. And so this idea of returning to work isn't as appealing to all of us. Returning to the office, I should say. I know we're all working. Returning to the office may not look the same for everyone. And therefore, taking an intersectional lens, taking a lens that really crosses gender, race, other experiences, other marginalized identities, physical disability, neurodiversity, etc. I think that's very important as leaders make these decisions on how are we going to return to the office, whether we're going to return to the office, and understand that all of us are dealing with different issues. And so we cannot take sort of our privileged standpoint, we're not responsible for other people in our family right now. We all just want to return to the office because that's the way forward. I think we need more nuance in that conversation.
We certainly need more nuance. Ruchika, I always enjoy speaking with you. We have some more members joining us in the stream. Jeremy says, thank you, Ruchika, for sharing your thoughts on this topic. It is very important to discuss. And Shannon says, I really love the visibility conversation we are having here. So if you're not following Ruchika on LinkedIn, be sure to follow her and check out her new book when it comes out. Do we have a date for that yet?
Yeah, it's February 2022. It'll be with MIT Press. And for the moment, it's called Inclusion on Purpose, taking an intersectional approach to workplace belonging.
Awesome. Ruchika, thank you again for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
That was Ruchika Tulsian breaking down for us some ways that we can make sure that the workplace is inclusion to Asian workers. I want to thank her for joining us on today's show. All right, tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, we're having a conversation about America's manufacturing industry. How can we make it more competitive and resilient? Tomorrow, we're speaking with an expert from the McKinsey Global Institute about which industries are poised the most for change. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks for watching LinkedIn News Live.